Today we're here with Jen from Sunny Title, and today we're actually going to be talking about post-occupancy. And one of the questions, of the many questions that we have, Jen, for you is, what is post-occupancy?
So a post-occupancy is basically when a buyer and a seller agree that the seller is going to occupy the property after closing.
The other question, Jen, is what are the terms of a post-occupancy agreement?
So the great thing about a post-occupancy agreement is that the terms are whatever the buyer and seller agree. So I always state that that agreement should say what the buyer's wants and needs are, what any deal breakers are, as well as for the seller. And that's where you need a trusted, knowledgeable real estate agent to help you come up with that agreement so that whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, you're being represented and protected.
Right, and it's actually great to know both sides of the transaction. Just so you're able to help both buyers and sellers.
Correct.
The other question that we have here is, who is responsible for utilities and maintenance during the post-occupancy?
So typically the seller is actually the one that's responsible for, maintaining the property and paying utilities. And it's also stated in most cases, not only on the contract, but it's also stated on the post-occupancy agreement that's signed by both parties.
Right, that makes sense. And the other question that we have is, what happens if there are any delays in occupancy by the seller?
So this is a question I get asked all the time, specifically by buyers, like, hey, what's going to happen if the seller doesn't move out? What is there to do? Well, again, going back to that post-occupancy agreement, which is a document that's signed by both buyer and seller agreeing to what those terms are and stating when that seller has to vacate the property. And in most cases, that agreement's also going to state if the seller does not vacate the property by X date, then there's usually what we call a security deposit that's held at the title company from the seller's proceeds that are used to give over to the buyer. So, hey, Mr. Seller, you didn't move out by September 30th. The agreement says that if you don't move out by that date, that $5,000 deposit gets refunded over to the buyer. So usually that motivates the sellers. I mean, it would motivate me to move out on time. So that's why that is done. It's not because the buyer wants to take those funds from the seller, but they just want them to be motivated so that they can move out.
Right, and that also provides clarity to when you need to move out, and also if you don't, then what are the consequences? And the other question that we have for you, Jen, is what condition should the property be left in?
So the seller is still obligated to leave the property in what's called broom swept condition and vacate it. So it's the same thing as if they were actually going to be closing on the day of closing and moving out, they would have to leave the property in the same condition once the post-occupancy period is over.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go into your house and you're like, what happened here? So,
yes. So the seller can definitely not leave their boxes around or junk or anything. They have to leave the property vacated.
Okay, so last question for you, Jen. When can the buyer move into their brand new home?
Of course, because that's what the buyer wants to do. They're ready to move in. Typically, I've even seen where when you do a post-occupancy agreement, there's always what's called the final walkthrough, and that's where the buyer goes to the property with the seller, make sure that the seller in fact has left the property. And I've seen it where they literally finish that walkthrough and the moving truck is outside ready to move their things in, so they can move in immediately after the post-occupancy period is over.
Oh, that's good to know. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Much fun.
Yeah, of course. And if you guys have any questions for us about post-occupancy or any other questions, please let us know in the comments below. And till next time, bye.